So good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the third session of the virtual dialogues on resilient infrastructure. I'm Belinda Hewitt from ADB's Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Division. So ADB has launched this year-long interactive series as a platform to share ideas, lessons learned, and to stimulate dialogue on resilient critical infrastructure systems. We hope that the learning and the ideas from this series can directly inform ADB's support for resilient infrastructure in developing member countries. So the first session of the virtual dialogues, held in October, introduced the overall series and shared global and regional perspectives on infrastructure and resilience. And the last session of the virtual dialogues on resilient infrastructure, held in November, looked at the importance of assessing climate and disaster risks for infrastructure systems, particularly in the context of these very much increasing uncertainties faced by countries in Asia and the Pacific. And the session explored good practice and trends for assessing climate and disaster risks for infrastructure, the advantages of shifting upstream in that process, utilisation of data and technology, and the need to institutionalise assessment. Also, the role of stakeholders, inclusive participation, and capacity development were a real focus. So today, we look forward to a very collaborative discussion, hopefully involving all of you, on measures for strengthening resilience of infrastructure. And this is the last virtual dialogue for the season 1 and for 2020. Season 2 will commence in early 2021. And further events will be announced on the event series website. So before we get into the content, I'm going to start with the least exciting part of the session, which is the house rules. So we'll ask you to please remain on mute throughout the presentations. However, you are very much encouraged to post questions in the chat bar for the speakers. And later in the session, we're actually going to hold some breakout rooms to brainstorm on resilient infrastructure opportunities on 3 different topics. And we'll bring up a slide with those shortly. Great, so we'll be talking about infrastructure resilience, standards and design, nature-based solutions, and early warning systems. You'll actually have the opportunity to select which room you would like to join. To do that, we'll ask you to add a number in front of your Zoom name. And there are some instructions on the slide of how to do that. If you prefer not to add any number, we will just randomly assign you to a room. That is absolutely fine. And also just letting you know that the webinar session will be recorded, and the recording and the presentations will be shared on the website following the session. All right, so we're going to kick off the session with a bit of an audience poll, and we'll ask you to all participate. So this poll is asking you which resilience solution of the topics that we're going to cover today are you most familiar with? That should come up on your screen shortly. So please start voting. I see we've got some votes coming in. That's fantastic. And we will be sharing those results with you very shortly. We'll just give you a few more seconds to add your polling preference. Just 5 more seconds. Please select any answer. No answer is the wrong answer. Okay. We'll end that polling. And we're just sharing those poll results there. So here it's really interesting. We actually have a very diverse range of answers. I don't think we've had this even a spread across any of our polls so far. A slight leaning towards resilient design, but most people are familiar with one area. For those of you who aren't familiar with any of these, you're in the right place because we will be exploring all of these topics today. Great, so let's get underway, and I'd like to start the session by providing a warm welcome to John Dora. John is the Director of Climate Sense Global, we're really lucky to have John here today. He has 39 years of experience in managing infrastructure, including flood risk management and asset management of railway structures. He is definitely a very recognised international expert on climate change adaptation and standards. He's been working with international financial institutions and the International Standards Organisation, among many others, for whom he is the global lead for adaptation. John's also an accomplished lecturer who delivers courses on sustainability, asset management and resilience at the University of Birmingham and a visiting professor at the University of Surrey. Thanks very much, John. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Belinda. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here on this in this virtual facility, which is really good. And I'm glad to see so many people on this conference as well. I'm going to do some quick slides, just 4 or 5 slides talking about infrastructure and resilience. And these slides are based on a briefing paper that I prepared for the bank in June on infrastructure standards for enhancing the resilience of infrastructure. And I'm sure that'll be available to people. But if we go to the next slide, I just want to set the scene. On the next slide, please. Yeah, if we click down through the headings here, that's great. One of the things that strikes me, and I've been looking at adaptation for nearly 20 years, and the Paris Agreement is great. It includes for adaptation. Most people think about the Paris Agreement looking at mitigation and reducing greenhouse gases, but we're also thinking about adaptation. Article 7 in the Paris Agreement covers adaptation and making things more resilient. But you can see from these charts on the right from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that the climate is changing quite rapidly, very rapidly, and we're seeing much more in the way of extreme weather events and slow onset climate change, like sea level rise, is getting locked in. If we click down to the next sort of 3 bullets, yeah, the bottom right chart as well. One of the things that I've heard from some people, fairly senior people, is that, oh, we've had the Paris Agreement. We don't need to worry about making things resilient. We're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and everything's going to be fine. But the bottom right chart just shows that temperatures keep rising over centuries, taking centuries to stabilize, and sea levels will continue to rise. We're looking at maybe a 3-degree rise by the end of the century. If we could have another click. One more click, yeah, but opportunities are here. 2/3 of the infrastructure needed for 2050 is yet to be built. And that's a World Bank statement from COP22 at Marrakesh. Now, another couple of clicks if we get this whole slide up. The thing about infrastructure, though, is infrastructure design. That poll just now, resilient design is important. Infrastructure needs standards to make these things work. If we click again and click again, and one more click, and one more click, and one more, and one more. And stop there, that's great, yeah. Standards, we need standards, they make a difference. Standards can be mandated, requirement standards that say you shall do this. There are voluntary standards as well, guidelines that people will adopt. But standards can cover all sorts of different topics. Government's policies could be considered as standards or guidelines. Codes of practice are sort of voluntary standards, requirements, you shall do this. Infrastructure design standards are key to designing infrastructure safely. And we have tools like the structural Eurocodes that are used across the world, Chinese standards, American standards, Australian standards. Everybody uses standards to design infrastructure. They bring benefits through recognized best practice. And I use this term politically neutral. If we look at adaptation to climate change, ISO 14090 is a standard that says this is how to go about adaptation. There's no politics in there. There's no opinions. It's look at the impacts, do something about it. But many standards, design standards, need modifying to tackle the future resilience of infrastructure, because most of them are based on past climate. And also we need to think about other changes. Next slide. Now we keep clicking down until lenders, governments, now we've gone to the next slide. That's great. That's great. That's smashing. That's great. Standards entry points. The earlier you start to think about conceptual design to make things resilient is better. The earlier you can make decisions for resilient design is the better, is really good practice. It's easier to change designs while on the drawing board than when construction is underway. And earlier than actually putting pen to paper and designing something on a CAD system, on a drawing board, is to have planning and development rules that help to avoid hazardous locations, floodplains, coastal sites, which isn't always possible. The next slide gives us something about practical examples. And ISO 14090 was published last year as international best practice in resilience planning. As well as looking at any organization, this document can be used by any organization, whether they're agriculture, infrastructure, a football club, or a multinational oil and gas industry. It takes a flexible approach and looks at any stage of adaptation, whether you've just started or whether you have mature adaptation resilience plans. And it looks at systems thinking. We hear more about systems thinking. It looks at risk and impacts and prioritization. So risk-based prioritization, uncertainties in data and how to get around looking at uncertainties in terms of adaptive management. And it talks about sustainable solutions. It guides people to look at sustainability and not just building a way out of the climate crisis, because that can produce more greenhouse gas emissions. It links to Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and it makes organizations embed adaptation as business as usual in ordinary business policy, strategies and plans. And there's learning embedded in this document as well, learning your experience of adaptation and building that back into your long-term programs. One more click. Design codes, one more click. The next generation structural Eurocodes. The structural Eurocodes have been around for about a decade, and they're being modified to cater for using future climate data. And many countries across the world use these. And I know of other design codes that have climate resilience in mind. The big issue is that existing codes tend to be based on past climate. We need to look at the future climate. And as clients, as lenders, we have a kind of duty to make sure that people building infrastructure look at the future climate. One more click. Yeah, much guidance is available. Policy statements, design codes, and company codes as well. Next slide just brings up some opportunities. If we go right to the bottom of this one, if we keep on clicking, linking planning policy with avoiding development in exposed areas is key. Don't build where it floods. Don't build where there are hazards. Long-term infrastructure policies, and I'm talking 50, 100-year policies, are needed. So review infrastructure policies and strategies to make sure they look at future-proof design. Look at risk-based adaptation, prioritize on where the higher risks are. Think systems. Everything that we do is connected. Nature's a system. Society is a system. Society is underpinned by infrastructure. Infrastructure is interconnected. To make transport work, you need energy, you need water, you need people, you need leadership, governance. All these are parts of a system. User-managed adaptive approach. Don't design now for something that might happen in 100 years' time. Design now for what we understand might happen over the next 30 years and adapt that infrastructure in 20, 30 years' time for the next sort of epoch. So as we move forward incrementally, build sustainability into decision-making. We have a finite planet. We have finite resources on the planet, and build back better after destruction caused by hurricanes, caused by cyclones. So click once more. My last point is that lenders, governments, clients can all specify future climate resilience using existing standards. If you're specifying, you can specify better than the standards. Not all the existing standards are future-proof, but we can specify future-proofing. Some people say that's expensive, but actually expense is actually looking at cost, whereas we should be looking at value and outcome. So think about the benefits, think about the value, think about the outcome. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John, for those excellent opening remarks. There's
Pleasure,
one quick
thank
question in the chat bar, and I think we do have probably enough time for a very quick response that could then be explored further in the breakout groups. So this question was, in developing countries like India, where we're struggling with regular infrastructure development to get operation and maintenance to function, how do we get climate change into the equation?
That's a really good question, actually. It's interesting in India. I actually did a commission the other year for the World Bank looking at the Eastern Dedicated Freight Corridor, which has been built with existing standards, and they wanted to check the climate resilience of that corridor against flooding and heat. And my usual starting point for questions like this is to start the conversation. You know, if we've got operation and maintenance struggling with today's infrastructure, it's to think about what are the impacts on today's infrastructure caused by existing weather patterns, existing extreme weather patterns, and just start to engage with that conversation. And one of the issues is the operations and maintenance tend to be lower down the pecking order compared with shiny brand new infrastructure projects. I've spent most of my career in maintaining infrastructure, and it's been a struggle in getting maintenance higher up the agenda. But the important thing I will say about operations and maintenance, that's your early warning system. If we're having difficulty in operating and maintaining against current weather patterns, for instance, then there's an alarm bell ringing. So keep inspecting, keep reporting, make sure the reporting mechanisms are there. Good asset management means that there's a line of sight from the senior decision makers at the top right down to the people maintaining the infrastructure on the ground floor at the coalface. And there needs to be a robust reporting mechanism so that everything that happens day to day is understood by the people at the top. So there's capacity building. People at the top need to understand that. People maintaining and operating need to be able to report and have some action taken. I hope that helps.
Fantastic. That's great. Thanks, John. And yes, we'll have plenty more opportunity to explore this in the breakout groups and a session on early warning coming up. So we're now going to move into our burst talks. And for our burst talks, again, please do feel very free to post questions in the chat bar. If we don't have time to get to them, we will get to them in the breakout sessions. So next, I'm going to introduce for the first burst talk, Rob Wilby. So Dr. Rob Wilby is a hydroclimatologist and a professor of hydroclimatic modelling at Loughborough University in the UK. ADB is doing a lot of work with Rob, and his research focuses on the management of climate risks to freshwater systems and urban environments. Rob co-developed the statistical downscaling model, which is a public domain climate scenario tool that has been used in numerous risk assessments. He's also recently published a book called Climate Change in Practice. So over to you, Rob.
Thank you, Belinda, and welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in. As these images show, transport systems all around the world are already suffering the effects of extreme weather. We see here images of flooding in many great cities around the world, but these systems are also vulnerable to impacts from extreme heat, from sea level rise, from tropical cyclones, and also from the indirect effects of climate change, for instance, triggering landslides, which can also damage critical infrastructure. So as John was mentioning, engineers and planners are thinking very hard about how to protect this vulnerable infrastructure that is already in place, how it might be retrofitted to cope with more extreme weather conditions in the future, but also how to improve the design of future infrastructure so that it is more resilient to the expected impacts of climate change. Now, I only have a few minutes to provide some examples of how we've been doing this in practice, and I'm going to be referring to a case study from Vietnam. Now, as John has already mentioned, one of the key entry points for factoring adaptation into our planning and design of infrastructure is through engineering codes of practice and design procedures. And these typically involve the specification of key variables like intense rainfall or extreme temperatures that are factored into the design of the infrastructure. And this provides a key way in which we can bring climate information into the process. So, for example, if we're designing a culvert underneath a coastal road, we can think about how the floods of the future might change given expected changes in intense rainfall over the region. We can apply established extreme value statistics to estimate a value for a particular return period. We can look at how that extreme value statistic might change in the future based on climate model information. Now, of course, the future climate is highly uncertain, and there are many different climate models we could turn to. Some of them operate at very coarse scales, like 200 or 300 kilometers. Others can provide much finer resolution information. But there are key uncertainties over the life of some of our very long-lived infrastructure. And those uncertainties depend on the choice of model, what we assume about the future emissions, and also to do with the natural variability of the climate. And one way in which we can address that uncertainty is through tables like the one I'm showing you here, where we have these change factors for, again, a critical design variable like the 1-day maximum rainfall, based on all the climate model information that we could find from CMIP5, the latest generation of climate models used by the previous IPCC. And we extract the amount of change in that rainfall for a given return period. And you can see that there are no decimal points. There's no numbers like 31 or 38 in this table. By virtue of rounding up the numbers to the nearest 5%, we're acknowledging the uncertainty in the underlying data. But when we are designing infrastructure, we also have to remember that there's a broader context in which that infrastructure sits. So from the previous table, we might design that culvert to accommodate a 30% increase in rainfall. But if we neglect the fact that the coastal road beneath which the culvert sits is also vulnerable to storm surges and coastal erosion, then we will have neglected a key threat to this infrastructure. So we always have to think about adaptation in a much broader landscape of threats and opportunities. In this case, how might future sea level rise and surges change in the vicinity of the new roads being put into this area? And one way in which we've been trying to do this and to support engineers and designers in the region is by developing manuals, step-by-step recipes, we can think of them, that guide the practitioner through where to find the climate model information, how to analyze it to extract the key statistics, and how to implement the information in the design equations, taking into account the uncertainty in the climate model information. So we've created a number of resources that signpost engineers and practitioners to where that climate model information might be found. We've developed Excel spreadsheets that again guide practitioners step by step through the process. And so just to close then, my final remark is that I've only had the chance here to speak of one or two ways in which we might adapt a piece of infrastructure, in this case to increase risk of flooding from heavy rainfall or sea level rise. But I think it's always important to remember that we have a wide range of adaptation measures within our portfolio. We need to think of these in terms of a toolbox of possibilities, and in any given context, look at the widest possible range of measures that we can implement that might be appropriate over the expected lifetime of the infrastructure. I think that's probably a good point at which to end. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Rob. That's a really insightful presentation. I did get one direct message which links to the last point you mentioned on lifetime. How do we determine what is an appropriate timescale, return period, lifetime to select adaptation measures based on? Now, I'm sure you could talk about this for half an hour, but any brief insights on that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I just refer back to this table. So within national design codes, the expected design life is often specified by national codes. So it might be, for example, a 20-year design life, and you have to apply a 20-year return period standard to a particular piece of infrastructure. So we would refer to the appropriate point in a table like this and look at the climate change allowance. So let's say we're designing for a 20-year return period event for a piece of infrastructure that might be around until 2050. From this table, you can see that the climate models are telling us that we need to increase the design to cope with a 30% more intense one-day rainfall maximum. So that's an example of how those two worlds of the existing design and code practice meets with the world of the climate model information. So I hope that answers the question.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Rob. Great. So we'll now move right along to the next burst. So it's my real pleasure to introduce Breakout van Wezenbeek from Deltares. Breakout is an expert advisor on nature-based solutions. I know that's a topic of real interest to many of us, and ecosystem-based adaptation at Deltares. Her roles have included advising and training departments of infrastructure and environment of several governments in Asia, leading the writing process for the implementation guidelines for nature-based solutions together with the World Bank and other authors, and developing a set of guidelines on natural river management, including nature-based solutions and mitigation of fluvial flooding in an urban setting for the Asian Development Bank. And she teaches at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands as well. Over to you, Breakout.
Thank you, Belinda. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I will elaborate a bit on what the previous speaker said, but then in the light of nature-based solutions. And for nature-based solutions, again, a risk-based approach is very important to of course determine where am I going to work with natural solutions versus, let's say, conventional engineering solutions. And then if we look at this picture, infrastructure investments are not always optimized by using a risk-based approach. For example, if we look at flood risk protection infrastructure, this levee, which is a big seawall, it's actually protecting 5 fishermen that live behind it on the left side, which is the landward side. So where John already mentioned including of the system in your infrastructure design, here the natural system was undermined by putting this levee through it and not included in design. But also the social system was not really integrated because these fishermen, of course, their main livelihood depends on their boats, and you see their boats lying at the end of this big levee. And usually fishermen like to drag their boat to their house so that they can guard their boat during the night and that they can directly move and have access towards the sea. So basically here the amount of assets that you protect does not outweigh the cost of the big seawall. So basically, a good assessment of what to put where can be informed by a risk-based approach. And if we look to the right, that also accounts for nature-based solutions, of course, because here this is after the Asian tsunami in Banda Aceh, where people many NGOs reverted to planting back mangroves there. But if we look at it from a risk reduction perspective, these tiny stacks of mangrove are of course not going to stop a tsunami. So there's this balance. We need to test nature-based solutions still in how much risk they can reduce, but also in areas where risk is rather low or maybe too intense, other measures may apply. And another speaker said that before me as well, but we need to evaluate between structural, non-structural measures and green and gray measures and put the right measure in the most optimal place. So in terms of a tsunami, actually an early warning system may be more appropriate and keep these people more safe. So how can we integrate natural systems better in infrastructure development? Well, first of all, what we put in ADB guidelines is to respect flows of water, sediment, nutrients, and species in infrastructure design. And what would be different is you need to look at a bit of a larger scale and adopt a landscape scale perspective. For example, if we look in rivers, an intervention in a midstream may influence downstream flooding. It may actually amplify the flood wave and push flooding downstream. So an evaluation of what your intervention does upstream and downstream is needed, but also in the hotspot area, you can look at whether you can maybe solve the problem by an upstream intervention instead of an intervention in place. So adopting this system scale perspective will lead to better interventions and outweigh actually negative effects on a larger scale. Here, what does it mean in this picture, for example, is as you see with many seawalls, coastal levees and river levees, is that the natural system is not included. So typically levee is put at the low water line, often to keep it straight because there's a sandy subsoil. However, thereby you will actually disconnect the natural system from input of water, of sediment. And thereby the natural system will basically die or actually be unhealthy, while your natural system, which you see in the last picture, picture C, can actually play a vital role in reducing flood risk if you set back your conventional infrastructure, integrating the natural system in front of it. This system may be able to reduce waves, currents, so meaning you can actually have a lower, cheaper levee design, which is more safe and more adaptable for the future, and it will cost you a lot less maintenance. So these are some of the concepts that are starting to get more popular and used across the world. Another problem we're facing with the nature-based solutions is that our standard cost-benefit assessment method is not including benefits that nature-based solutions derive. So if we, for example, use an approach where we work with the internal economic rate of return, benefits that nature-based solutions offer, such as provision of livelihoods, fisheries, food, additional resources, tourism, are typically not accounted for in these standard cost-benefit assessments. So it means that we actually should start weighing these benefits, and we're trying to do that in several projects. And what we then find is that for nature-based solutions, their investment costs often are the same as for gray solutions. But if we look on longer terms and larger landscape scales, their operation and maintenance costs and their negative effects, for example, upstream or downstream, are a lot lower than for gray infrastructure. So it's important that we adopt our cost-benefit analysis to actually account for the benefits and account for effects on larger time periods of time. Also really important here is that the cost-benefit analysis achieves to derive an optimized portfolio of measures, both green and gray, and that it compares different alternatives for different climate scenarios, for example. I'm going too far. So the way forward, what are we doing? Well, the question is, if we stick to doing business as usual. I mean, everything is sort of geared towards designing and implementing great infrastructure. So how do we revert from business as usual? Well, making guidelines, such as the guidelines we made for ADB, is of course one thing. And then doing technological testing of performance of nature-based solutions is another. But I'm pretty sure that we will actually, we are advancing in the technological part of nature-based solutions and their ability to reduce risk. However, one of the most important things we need to tackle is institutional barriers. Every system that we work with, all institutions are divided in sectoral divisions. And what we need for nature-based solutions, for example, to account for benefits, is to have more cross-sectoral and actually sort of to cover these cross-sectoral barriers that they are. So for example, where the Department of Infrastructure may be responsible for construction of a flood risk reduction solution, if it's a nature-based solution, maintenance and management can be with the Department of Environment, for example. So we need this we need these institutions to actually start collaborating. And I was thinking we could, for example, use some of the COVID recovery funding to shift a bit more to pre-feasibility stages of projects, where we actually start to evaluate the natural system better and start to incentivize this collaboration between institutions and departments. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gerhard. That was a really, really great overview. We've got a few questions in the chat bar. I'll just quickly take one of these and then perhaps the rest could be covered in the breakout group. So one question was, nature-based solutions are the best solutions and will be more low cost and work better usually. Is this correct? If so, why are we still giving preference to higher cost grey solutions?
Is it correct whether they work better?
And costly.
And are less costly? I think it's case dependent, so it's case specific. And I think in some areas they require a lot of space. So if we have high risk and many people living close to the waterline, it may be more difficult to implement them. I think integrating them in our standard infrastructure design and construction procedures is something that should happen. And then we should evaluate whether they perform better or not. But I think often, well, like I said, if we look on the long term, they may have additional benefits and be more adaptable and flexible with respect to climate change, for example.
Fantastic. Thanks. I'm sure there's much more we can discuss about that. Well, thank you so much. In the interest of time, we will move right along to the third burst talk. So it's my pleasure to introduce Carleen Yu. Carleen is the team lead for risk acknowledgement applications at RIMES. She's also the project director for RIMES component of the World Bank Climate Adaptation and Resilience for South Asia project. She has more than 10 years experience working in academia, with government agencies, with NGOs and with private sector in implementing programs and initiatives relating to early warning, disaster risk reduction and climate resilience. So over to you, Carleen, and just let us know when you want us to move through the slides. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, Belinda. And again, good afternoon to everyone. You may, I think, proceed to the next slide directly. I understand and I am very happy to learn about various approaches as well as practical examples which were presented by earlier colleagues. My presentation would mainly focus on early warning systems. And as we all know, early warning is a national concern mainly for two reasons. And one of that is for public safety. And the second of which is more on preserving the national asset base of countries. And this includes, of course, our communication, transport, energy, water, and other critical infrastructures. So these infrastructures, are, as we all know, are very critical to early warning, but at the same time, early warning is also critical to planning, to operation, as well as maintenance of these infrastructures. In fact, one single extreme event can already lead to a broad breakdown of infrastructures of certain locations. Next slide, please. So we've seen a lot of improvements in the way forecasts or early warning information is developed. So even in the early warning, in the forecasting or modeling frameworks, we've seen increases in terms of accuracy, in terms of the available products and services from hydromet services, in terms of the lead times, and of course, in terms of the resolution. And we've moved towards probabilistic forecasting as well as scenario based approaches as well. In the last 5 years or so, countries are also adapting impact-based forecasting, making use of available technologies as well as models that they could provide online through web-based portals or decision support systems. So now what these countries are doing is they integrate hazard forecasts with vulnerability information, and particularly vulnerability curves for specific hazards, like for example, floods or typhoons or strong winds. In the last 2 or 3 years, we have seen the DRM community as well as social protection agencies already talk about impact forecasting, risk-based warning, wherein they added an element of customization up to the local level. So this means that they do not only talk about vulnerabilities, general vulnerabilities, but more on customized or localized vulnerabilities specific to certain communities that are affected. And aside from impact forecasts, they also discuss what are the likely responses that we could advise or provide guidance to affected communities or areas. So please press next. So this is just a very broad example of how multi-time scales of forecasts could be used for infrastructure planning or infrastructure monitoring or operations. So for long-term forecasts, like what we had with climate projections or scenarios, we could definitely use them for planning and investment in new infrastructure, whether it's ecosystem-based approach or other approaches. But for seasonal forecasts, the long-range forecast, we could use it to monitor as well as manage this existing infrastructure, be it a dam or a reservoir or a transport or a road network. For short-range forecasts, we could use this as information to help us identify which areas we could probably monitor for flooding or other hazards. So similarly, in the DRM community, there's move towards integrating a lot of information, from risk assessments to historical disaster information to historical climate variability, mixed with forecasts, long-range forecasts, and even sometimes climate assessments or climate projections. And then these are used as basis for when they develop, for example, what they call as hazard thresholds or impact forecasts, so that they can determine what would be the triggers for specific actions or decisions that they would make. And with these specific decisions, then they develop protocols on how we do respond, how do we activate the response of certain communities, or how do we coordinate the response at the national level, at the regional, or up to the local level. And I'd like to emphasize this because this is very much applicable also for infrastructure planning or infrastructure operations and maintenance. And we've seen a lot of countries already adopting the use of decision support tools, decision support systems, particularly for water sector or transport sector, in terms of monitoring their own infrastructures and services. So next slide, please. Here, we see a dam, DSS, reservoir DSS in Thailand. Next slide. Next, please. And you can see from this information that the Royal Irrigation Department in Thailand is comparing the water levels in their reservoirs with the capacity of these reservoirs. So that means that they are managing when to release water, when to withhold water, so that they can manage drought or flood risks also. Next slide. There's another example for coastal hazard management and early warning for communities in Europe. So this is very much useful for managing coastal infrastructure, whether you put in embankments to prevent soil erosion or other kinds of secondary hazards caused by coastal hazards. And then the next slide, please. So this a lot of examples. This one is in the US for transport monitoring, road network monitoring, particularly during winter. Next slide. And this one is a sample of road network or transport network monitoring during all weather timescales. So this is very much useful for basically for monitoring for operations and maintenance of certain infrastructures, and as well as traffic management. Next slide. So I'm just going to discuss very briefly two of the samples, two of the work that we do, that we have done in RHYMES. The first of which is a decision support system that we have developed for Tamil Nadu in India, where we develop a system for disaster risk management communities. But then this was used by policymakers. We were happy to note that this was used by policymakers also in terms of their priorities for investment. So what they are using this system for is they're checking which areas are the particular hotspots for flood. And then that's their basis for decisions in prioritizing, okay, what they should be doing in those hotspots to improve or at least to mitigate flooding. The right side, I'm showing to you an example of a memo, because this Sri Lanka example is quite interesting. Without technology, without the decision support system, the Department of Irrigation just made use of early warning information and seasonal forecast from the Department of Meteorology in Sri Lanka. So the Department of Meteorology just said that the seasonal forecast for the upcoming monsoon is above normal. And what the Department of Irrigation did is they released water early on before the onset of the season because they wanted to reduce the potential risk of flooding. And of course, that would also mean that they were managing their infrastructure, their dams and their reservoirs. So that's one of the things that EWS or early warning information could be used to manage infrastructure or even plan for future infrastructures. And I'd just like to hone in into four messages with EWS and infrastructure planning, or O&M. First is the importance of capitalizing on the move towards impact forecasting and risk-based warning. This was also emphasized in the presentation on nature-based solutions for us to focus on risk-based solutions. Second is to make use of all available data or information for all timescales. The historical data would help us identify thresholds. The future data would help us identify potential risks. And then the third is utilize available technology, because there's a lot of improvements in technology, in artificial intelligence, in decision support system, in modeling. This could be integrated into one database wherein we could put in all the models and generate solutions that would assist in planning as well as decision making. And the fourth, of course, the most important, even without technology, even without all these advancements, there is still scope for decision makers in different sectors involved in infrastructure management to set thresholds and triggers that could define their decisions for managing the infrastructure that they are looking after. So I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Carleen. I think this is so interesting because we often hear about early warning systems at a very broad level, but this technology is moving so fast. So both to hear these updates and to get some more granular insights on how it relates to infrastructure operation and infrastructure broadly is fantastic. Just very briefly, there was a question that was actually, I think, directed at the previous speaker, but I think it's also very relevant for you. So perhaps just a very brief response in terms of, I imagine, so the comment was that cross-sectoral working can take a lot of time and effort. Now, I imagine working across sectors is absolutely at the core of this early warning system work that you're doing and working across departments. Do you have any tips on how that process can work effectively or be speeded up?
Thank you very much, Belinda. It's really critical, and it's an interesting question. How we do it is we do it at this institutional level. So we gather the information providers, the early warning information providers, particularly the hydromet services or the water agencies, along with sectoral agencies, so that there is a sort of agreement as to what forecasts are and what it means to different sectors. And that's how they work, how they're able to work together from early warning information at the technical level to something that is translated already for sectoral use and integration into decisions and plans.
Fantastic. That's a really great answer. Thank you. Okay. So thanks so much, Colleen. We're now going to move along to our interactive part of the session, which is our breakout room discussions. So I'm just going to bring up a brief slide with the breakout room discussion question. But over the next 20 minutes, we're going to ask you to brainstorm your ideas on how to operationalise resilience strengthening measures in ADB's developing member countries. And if you have elected a specific breakout room, then you will be directed into that breakout room. If you haven't, then you will be randomly assigned to a room. You're going to have roughly around 20 minutes for this discussion, and this discussions will be moderated by the various speakers that you've heard today. And at the end of the 20 odd minutes, we'll come back into plenary and those moderators will share the key messages from that discussion. Great, so I'll ask my colleagues to transfer us into those breakout rooms now. Thank you. So I believe we have most of us back in the plenary now. We're now going to go into sharing back some of the key insights from those hopefully very rich discussions in the group. Now perhaps I will go in reverse order and start with Caroline. Will you be happy to share back from your group first?
All right, thanks again, Belinda. I think we had around 10 members in the group, and we had discussions on resilient infrastructure, particularly in relation to early warning systems. And some of the key takeaways in the discussion was that one, there's opportunity for us to redesign existing infrastructure to become more resilient. But we also recognize that not all can be made disaster or climate resilient. So there will be bits and pieces of infrastructure that will remain vulnerable to certain hazards. And the second, of course, noting these conditions, then we can resort to using early warning to at least maintain, operate, or manage this infrastructure, particularly during hazard events. So there was, I think James from the group actually shared a very interesting case in Japan wherein they have an early warning system that would automatically shut down transport networks in case of an earthquake. So that's actually a very good example. And then the third is there was emphasis also on impact-based forecasting and the sharing of data among government agencies and ministries. So this was pointed out as one of the critical factors, but one of the more difficult things that we could achieve. So that's those are the three key takeaways in our discussion. Thanks. Back to you, Belinda.
Fantastic, Colleen. That sounded like a really great discussion. Okay, Blair, will you be happy to share back the key messages from your group, please?
Yes, thank you. Okay, we had a diverse group, many ADB officers, but also external. We heard Indonesia and Myanmar and other countries were present. And we had different sectors from different infrastructural sectors, such as transportation or flood risk reduction infrastructure. We had a discussion about what could help forward implementation of nature-based solutions. And one of the things that was said that was kind of interesting is that it's basically a continuum where we may go in the future to fully substitute gray solutions with nature-based solutions, so nature-based solutions only, which may be most cost-effective, but that we are likely not there yet, and that we often refer to complementing gray infrastructure with nature-based solutions or with natural resources that are already present, and that we sometimes try to look for an economic optimum there. And then as a third, that often still projects refer to conventional infrastructure, where they take actually the natural system as a bit of insurance or over design, so an extra protection element. But of course, this option is the most expensive because the MBS is not integrated in the full design. then there was a good point which was repeated several times, that to do MBS fully, there is really a lack of technological standards. So how do we quantify the contribution of mangroves to risk reduction, for example? I know globally there are several efforts in making these standards. I think there were 3 takeaway home messages that I extracted from the session. One which I liked a lot is that it was mentioned that we do not always enter the design process and the project process with an open mind. Often we already have like a predefined solution in our mind. So the takeaway there is enter with an open mind, and make get multiple experts of different sectors on the table, and come up with a collaborative design, and not with the single sectoral, single function design that you maybe already had in your mind. We felt that there's added value there, and I like that comment. There was another takeaway, which is to implement nature-based solutions well, you need to adopt a network approach. And respect the interlinkages in a landscape between different infrastructural elements and different natural system elements. And there were several projects and examples, for example, from urban networks where this was already done in a good way. And then the third takeaway is nature-based solutions should be taken into account in all project stages that was mentioned. So from the concept phase, where you have to keep the open mind, to the pre-feasibility, the feasibility, and the design and O&M stages. Thank you.
Fantastic, a really rich discussion there. Okay, so finally we'll move on to John and Rob. I'm not sure if both of you want to share a couple of key takeaways, or just one of you, up to you.
John, do you want to go first?
Well, I'll just mention that one of the challenges that we were talking about was getting the balance and getting climate change adaptation factored into projects, and some of that stems from the awareness and the capacity, I think, of governments, clients, to understand adaptation, its priority and its urgency. I think that was one of the takeaways from me.
Yeah, I agree. I think that message came out very clearly to me, was the opportunity for developing capacities. And the key word here was with the client.
Co-creation is a phrase.
Co-creation with absolutely, with the client, with the design teams, the technical teams. And I know that that's something that ADB does really well when we've seen these workshops that bring together both the full assemblage of team members. The other message that came through very clearly was the power of demonstration projects to see what climate resilient infrastructure actually looks like, and to bring together examples from around the region and beyond to show in tangible ways what this really looks like, and to inspire others. I think as Breakout was making the point, to really open our minds to a much broader portfolio of measures and opportunities beyond the traditional lines of thinking. And I guess the finals from a practical and procedural point of view was looking at the terms of reference that are being issued and perhaps refining those to highlight particular climate hazards and issues and opportunities that might be considered within the project. So those were the main points that I took away. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, John and Rob. Great to hear that overview. Right, so our session is almost coming to an end, but first of all, we're going to have a couple of quick polls, and we really hope that these polls can actually inform the next couple of resilient infrastructure sessions that we hold next year. So those polls will be up on the screen shortly. There's two. The first one will ask the question, which webinar topic will be most of interest for you for future events? And the second one is which sector you might be more interested in. So please do participate in those two polls. It's multiple choice, there's no wrong answer. And noting there is a feedback form on the website. If you have any particular ideas for future events, you're very welcome to submit those via the website feedback form. See a few answers coming in here. We'll give you another few seconds. Wow, this is really interesting. Again, we've got a very big spread of results. We'll just give you another 10 seconds to put your answers in. We're very interested to see this. Okay, we'll close off those polls now and share them, please. So, Brehe, you've stimulated some great interest today because our top topic is nature-based solutions. This is no surprise. I mean, this is a real area of interest for us. But you know, it's actually very interesting to see that there is quite an even spread of interest across the topics there. And secondly, in terms of sectors, urban resilience and resilient water systems are of great interest. I know colleagues, Manoj and Verinda, and then Jeff, who's on the line from the water sector group, hopefully would be interested to collaborate with us on these sector sessions next year. But we also, again, have a very even spread of results, so that's great to see. Right, so we'll close those polls now. Thank you. So I'm just going to give a very quick recap of some of the messages I've seen today. You know, there's been some really interesting points come through. I think one point I saw come up in almost every presentation was the importance of local context. And for ADB working across all of our very different developing member countries, this is critical. It needs to be taken into account whether we're talking about standards, designing roads, or evaluating and designing effective nature-based solutions. We talked a lot about the importance of risk-informed solutions and risk-informed decision-making to prioritise resilience investments and decision-making. A lot of focus on the need for integration, for network and for systems approaches. Again, whether that relates to looking at combining natural and grey infrastructure, integrating suites of adaptation measures, working across sectors, or integrating early warning system information. There was some focus on the importance of effectively evaluating and factoring the economic cost of climate and disaster resilience risk impacts, and then resilience measures. And there was also mention of the benefits of developing standards, guidance, protocols, and providing capacity building, including on how we design and manage resilient infrastructure, how we evaluate and design robust and cost-effective nature-based solutions, and triggers for how we respond to early warning systems. And I think, you know, as ADB colleagues on the line, I'm sure we'll all be listening with great interest, as we hope these are areas that we can continue to support. Finally, the area that I'd most like to emphasize that came through, I think the strongest, was we're talking today about resilient solutions, but there is no one solution. We really need to take multiple approaches. And I love this term, a toolbox of opportunities. So in any given context, looking at the widest range of options possible and keeping open minds. Now, this is the final event for 2020. Please keep an eye on the website. We'll post a link to the website there where we will be announcing further events. In the session, the breakout session I was in, there was mention from ADB colleagues about the importance of dialogue on both sides, including between ADB and the client, to understand the realities on the ground and translate these ideas that we've been talking about today into reality. So we hope to bring in more of our operations colleagues and departments to collaborate on events next year. The presentations and other resources will be posted on the website. And before I wrap up, I'd also just like to say a very big thank you to Sining Cuevas. She has been absolutely instrumental in developing this series, but she'll be wrapping up her role with us this year. So thank you, Sining. Your work has been truly fantastic. So thank you everyone for joining us today and for engaging so actively in discussions. We look forward to seeing you next year, and all the best for your holiday season if you're celebrating. Bye.